911, what's your emergency?
It is perhaps needless to tell you that the last 2 years have drastically changed the history that may have been. And while we were losing loved ones, people that were key and important in our lives and who we are, as our brothers and sisters worldwide, we're losing jobs, getting underpaid, dropping out of schools and universities due to not being able to pay the tuition even with assistance. As student loans were being affected, as dreams were shattering, as people were no longer able to simply feed themselves, as relationships were breaking, there was only one question that came to every single one of our minds, no matter what the occupation. And that question was, how can we help? How can we help get rid of this horrendous pandemic? And today, I will answer all your questions and allow every single one of you to be a big part of how long this pandemic truly continues. Perhaps there is no question that even before the vaccines were released to the public, or anyone in the front line or the elderly, the people from the West, the richer countries from the West, had already ordered millions of doses, hundreds of millions of doses, particularly the big Western countries that have reportedly in newspapers quoted to be hoarding vaccines. Now the interesting thing is, I would not like to vilify these big countries, because with the UNICEF asking for vaccines to be donated, these countries did donate many vaccines to the lower income countries. But the problem was not there. The problem was not the fact that whether they were not donating or they were donating. The plain fact was the issue of expiry dates. As you can see in the official Moderna website, the shelf life of Moderna vaccine is 30 days at the temperature of 2 degrees to 8 degrees Celsius. Now if you look at Pfizer, the shelf life of Pfizer vaccine is also 30 days. One constant motif you'll notice in these vaccines are that after puncturing the vials, after giving a dose, it can last for a very short time, for about a day. The shelf life of the Sinovac is 12 months, so it is a lot more than both the Moderna and Pfizer, at the same refrigeration temperature of 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. If you look at the shelf life of Johnson's & Johnson's, you can see that the shelf life is 3 to 4.5 months. Now, if you see this guideline given to vaccination clinics for AstraZeneca, the AstraZeneca vaccine also has to be stored at the relatively same kind of refrigeration temperatures of 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. But the shelf life of the AstraZeneca vaccine is 6 months, unlike any of the other vaccines. Although it is shorter than the Sinovac, this is quite longer than the 1 month shelf life of both the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines. This overlooked phenomenon of expire dates is seen in this exemplary excerpt from this article from MSN News from around a month ago. If you look at this article closely, you can see that it says that 20,000 doses of vaccines were destroyed in Malawi, while 59,000 were destroyed in South Sudan. And 1.7 million AstraZeneca doses were rendered expired in the Democratic Republic of Congo. These are just some examples, and that pinpoints the main problem that comes with mass donations made by the COVAX program. And that problem is evident when you look at the vaccination rates in some of these low to middle income countries. And so you realize that most of the donations made by richer countries through the COVAX program expire and are rendered useless. And that leaves these nations no choice but to dispose of all this millions of vaccines. In a recent example, Bangladesh received around 2 million doses of Sinovac and 2.5 doses of Moderna vaccine. But the issue is Bangladesh, so far, and the highest, has been able to only vaccinate 80,000 people a day. And so when these vaccinations have such a close expiry date, it leaves no space to be able to catch up before the expiry date occurs. Now, as you can see, in Bangladesh, they have fully vaccinated 2.6% of their population. And that's their population right there. And that's 4.28 million people. And so, at the rate of a high average of 80,000 per day, it would take 3 years just to reach 50% of fully vaccinated people. Now in India, they're doing 2,022,000 shots per day, in average. And they have fully vaccinated 59 million people. That is 4.23% of the population. And so, at this rate, it would take 302 days to reach 50%. And that's only if India goes at this rate. Now if we can see Kenya. Now Kenya is among the richer nations in Africa. And it was able to reach 1.03 million vaccinations. And their population is 54 million. And so, at this rate, it would take Kenya around 3 years to reach 50%, just like in Bangladesh. For South Africa, they're doing 50,000 to 60,000 per day, and that's the current rate. So, right now they have 0.8% fully vaccinated people, and that means it would take around 537 days to reach 50%. That means almost 2 years. As of July 3rd, 2021, 3.13 billion doses have been totally given. That's 860 million fully vaccinated. And that is 11% of the entire world. Just 11%. And now, as we are in the third week of September, it is possible that you are noticing that the corona cases worldwide are going down. And so, it's possible that you may be thinking that we don't need to vaccinate. I would say and request to think again, because if you realize the pandemic's trend, every time the world's cases start to drop, a new variant comes and changes the story, especially in regions that are less vaccinated. There was the Alpha, the Beta, the Gamma, Delta, Lambda, and now recently, the Mu. As long as we don't have the world vaccinated faster, the world's people would have to rely on natural immunity or herd immunity, quite enforced by the anti-vaccinators do not quite understand the extenuating consequences of achieving immunity through that process. To be able to develop antibodies for corona naturally, a person must get corona at least multiple times. And I have seen firsthand, through family members, how taxing it is, physically and emotionally. Moreover, one thing that we have to consider is every time a person gets COVID-19, they have to go through isolation, and that's about 10 days. And that is usually followed by a 2-week quarantine period. So in total, a person loses a month if they get COVID-19. And for people who are rich and have assets, that's not a big deal. But for most of the world that rely on monthly pay, it is a huge deal because their families run on that monthly pay. And so, achieving immunity through that method would paralyze families financially. As you can see here in this list of statistics, having over 10,000 cases per 100 people in a country is not nearly low enough to be able to see the end of the pandemic. Moreover, as another variant may be expected to rise in the next few weeks, to truly get to an end of the pandemic and truly get to a situation where all the countries are having low number of cases, whether it's domestically or internationally, we have to get higher vaccination rates to be able to have lower cases. Because as we've seen in the past, the regions with lower vaccination rates are the places that see the most spikes whenever a mutant variant rises, whether that is within a country or outside of a country, whether it's domestic or international. Now, to counter the supply issue and the issue of expiry dates, as well as the issue of the vaccination rates, several third world nations had supported the proposal made by South Africa and India back in October in 2020. They went to the World Trade Organization with their proposal, and that's when the battle began. A long battle where almost no one supported the third world countries. The European Union is against any concept of a patent waiver that India and South Africa, as well as most of the third world countries, support. The European Union has gone against it, and so has the World Bank. And that is quite interesting because if you type up World Bank on Wikipedia, it says that their goal is the reduction of poverty. And even a notable journal like the Journal of Economic Perspectives said in 2016 that the World Bank is best understood as an organization that facilitates international agreements to reduce poverty. Now, a few months ago, very interestingly, the United States, after Joe Biden was elected president, he came in and he supported the patent waiver, an overturn of decision. But nonetheless, the US seemingly supports the patent waiver. But the big pharmaceutical industries from both the US and the UK, like AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Moderna, all these companies, the big pharma, do not want a patent waiver. Because if the patents are waived, then they lose control over the pricing of the vaccines. Now the problem is that if we keep that control of pricing to the pharmaceutical companies that make the vaccines currently, then what happens is that as the pandemic moves near its end, as richer countries become more and more vaccinated, what will happen is that these companies will move towards making more vaccines for the booster program, because that is something that will cost money. The other vaccines are given to people for free, the first and second doses, in the case of Pfizer and Moderna, as well as AstraZeneca. Now the UK has already been working on the booster program, and so have been the other pharmaceutical companies. And that means the supplies to the vaccines to the low to mid-income countries is going to face a tremendous amount of stress. Because at the end of the day, pharmaceutical companies are doing business. And that means the product that brings the company money is the one that the company will more favor. If there is no patent waiver, what would happen is that the world debt will increase by around $70 billion. Oxfam, a independent charitable organization that focuses on global poverty, in its research and its calculations, it has come to the conclusion that if the vaccination production would be ramped up, people in the low to middle income countries could be estimatedly vaccinated for $6.5 billion. But if everything continues the way it is, then this production and distribution cost will rise up to around $80 billion. Now, as you can see here, climate change related mortality can drop the global GDP by 60%, and that will of course play a huge role in these repayments when it comes to the bonds created and sold during this pandemic. At the end of this pandemic, if the vaccines are not waived, there will be an addition of $783 billion into the already high global debt. And that would be 10 times of if the vaccines were waived. And this is said by the Oxford University researchers from a study that they conducted using the world debts. There has already been a $289 trillion jump of the global debt from before the pandemic. That is a 12% jump in the global debt. Here you can see the emerging market debts and emerged market debt growth. Emerging market means developing countries, and the emerged markets roughly means the developed countries. Now what happens is that if debts to GDP ratio increases, then the country goes through a stage of inflation, increase in taxes, a recession, a decrease in employment, and that affects the poorest people in the country first, those without saved assets and saved money. Now, as you can see here, most of the countries that has vaccinated more than 20% of its population are all first world countries, European nations, or just very small countries. Now you may be wondering, what will happen if these nations cannot meet their repayment dates with interest? Because when a bond is issued and sold to a private company, it is expected that in its repayment date, it would be repaid with interest. And so when a nation sells too many bonds, what happens is, in the case that they cannot repay that amount with interest on time, the private investors will sell the bonds at a cheaper price, and that will affect that nation in the debt market, which means other investors will not buy this country's bonds. And this is extremely important globally. And that means in the coming few years, while we are trying to meet the climate expectations created by the Paris Agreement, we will need more and more money, and so more bonds will be issued and more debts will be made, as the global debt, which has already been high before the pandemic, is even higher now. And if the vaccinations are not waived, then the global debt will be 10 times as higher by the time the pandemic is finally over. Because not only would the vaccination prices in totality will be a lot more expensive, but the pandemic will last for a longer time just because of the low vaccination rates of the low-income to middle-income countries. And not only would that cause a global debt and an issue with regards to financing climate action, but it would increase the gap between these low-income, middle-income countries and the high-income countries. Because while high-income countries can increase its taxes and cause an inflation in their prices, low to middle-income countries can increase their taxes, but that would just decrease the quality of life in those countries. At least US has taken debt only in their own currency, which happens to be the reserve currency of the world. Which means that even after the US goes through a situation of inflation and higher taxes and a bit of a low economic situation, in its image it will bounce back, even though in reality none of these countries will actually bounce back. It will only seem like it did. And one thing we must not undermine, the kind of finance that is required to repair the damages that can be caused by natural disasters that is driven by climate change. So all the nations in the world must be careful to make sure that the global debt that is already so high by the end of the pandemic doesn't grow even higher to a degree where it can be catastrophic for the future of mankind. Because let's face it, that 1.5 degrees Celsius goal that people have created in the Paris Agreement, statistically and scientifically, that is probably never going to happen. But the key is to be close to it, because if you're close to it, then perhaps you can minimize some of the most drastic lifestyle changes that it can cause, the decrease in quality of life it can cause, especially to the poorer people of the low to mid-income countries as well as the high-income countries, because poverty is everywhere. During this pandemic, the debt to GDP ratio had increased in most countries, with debts increasing and GDP lowering, with the exception of countries like Israel, whose economy boomed. That being said, low to mid-income countries were taking debts and are still taking debts, but that doesn't mean that the high-income countries are not taking debts. They're continually taking debts, and possibly many of them, especially the ones that are responsible for manufacturing the vaccines thus far, have been taking unprecedented amounts of debt from sovereign funds, whether it be from their own sovereign funds, some other countries' sovereign funds, or private investors, which is the source of most debt. So it's only reasonable that the global debt had increased highly throughout the pandemic and continues to increase as high-income countries and low-income countries continue to take debts, or in other words,
sell
bonds, which country such as Japan is still selling, even after being in debt of a whopping 11 to 12 trillion dollars already. But Japan is still issuing bonds through Bank of Japan, and that is interesting because the question that naturally comes is that will these high-income countries be able to meet the deadlines after they sell these bonds and continually keep selling these bonds? Because a huge problem will come if they do not meet the deadlines. Now, World Bank had suspended the paybacks until the end of 2021 for prior debts. That being said, the debts that have been taken during the pandemic will be due in 10 years, 30 years, maybe 100 years' time. And the question comes, will they be able to repay the money as well as meet climate expectations as they agreed in the Paris Agreement? The question is, why is it that the World Bank president opposing the vaccine waiver? It is understandable why the European Union would do so. It is even more understandable why the big pharmaceutical companies would do so. But why the World Bank? Why would they choose that side? Now, their reasoning is that if the vaccines are waived, the improvement of these vaccines are going to stop. Another reason may be that this will create an incredible stress on the raw material market needed to make these vaccines. So the question is, can the third world countries be able to make these vaccines where vaccines can be made? Argentina, Bangladesh, Brazil, China, Indonesia, Ghana, South Africa, India, Turkey, and several others. Do they have the training required to make such a vaccine? Do they have the credibility to be able to certify the safety of these vaccines? And so, before any waiver is made, it is crucially important that the third world countries that can make vaccines be able to calculate exactly how fast and how well they can make them, and if they can guarantee safety of what they make. Because if they can, and if they can source the raw materials outside the US, because the US is not going to give the raw material, because soon the US will be more focused on making booster shots, a third vaccination, or a fourth vaccination even, down the line. Now, it's possible that some of the third world nation scientists do not have the experience with regards to nanoparticles, which are a key component of some of the American vaccines, such as the Pfizer and Moderna. But the point to be noted here is that they are not the only vaccines in the world that is being given. The Sinovac is being given and is recognized worldwide. AstraZeneca is being given, it's recognized worldwide. Some of the other new vaccines that are coming up are eventually going to be given and recognized worldwide. The point here is that vaccine makers can make the vaccines that are not mRNA based. The agreement that Bangladesh made with the Sinovac company had allowed Bangladesh to make millions of vaccines on their ground, and so their vaccination rates improved. But the problem with that agreement was that it's an initial endeavor which will improve with time, and if TRIPS waiver was implemented, then a lot more vaccines could be made by these compulsory license owners or even the voluntary license owners, because then more vaccines can be sent out into foreign countries as well as their own. And in that process, countries that have high death rates right now, such as many countries in Africa, they will have the chance to increase their supply of vaccines and therefore increase their supply of vaccination rates, as long as their governments can speed up registration. Now, unfortunately, the G7 nations did not support the waiver. They wanted more of a voluntary license kind of situation, which means that these nations would have to buy licenses from these pharmaceutical companies to get the recipe to be able to make these vaccines. And so that would create the same issue that would be created if we continue as we are right now. Now, while the G7 countries have proposed a voluntary licensing type of situation, the European Union had suggested the compulsory licensing type of a situation. But as you can see here in this article, the issue with vaccine manufacturing companies buying compulsory licensing is that they could make the vaccines, but they can't sell too much of it to other countries because of the TRIPS provisions, such as 31F, which doesn't allow people who make the vaccines, even under compulsory licenses, to sell or give their patented product more to foreign countries than to their own. Subsequently, a country cannot import product that is under a compulsory license if they don't get permission from the World Trade Organization. And so the benefits are clear in terms of global finances, in terms of climate action, in terms of repayments, in terms of vaccination rates, in terms of getting vaccination rates higher, in terms of getting more supplies to the low-income countries, to middle-income countries, And so this waiver, although does carry great benefits, such as getting more vaccine supply to all the low to middle income countries. And not just that, it will decrease the global debt, and that would increase the vaccination rates, and that means it could reach a 50% or even higher in a shorter amount of time. And that's the goal, because to be able to declare the end of the pandemic, it is important that the world is over 50% to near 60 to 80% vaccinated. Because the pandemic is not only just a pandemic of a physical ailment, but also a psychological one, a one of hysteria. And so not only is it important to reduce the fear of people, but it is also important because it gives people a competitive advantage against rising coronavirus variants like the Delta. And last but not least, it saves money for future natural disasters as well as climate actions that all these nations promised to contribute towards. The opposers of the TRIPS waiver are saying that the TRIPS waiver is not a short-term solution. And that is fascinating because when we have dragged the pandemic to such lengths, how can anyone even think that we could have a short-term solution? The only solution that we can have is a long-term one. And this is why we have to not only get a TRIPS waiver for some of the provisions such as the Article 31, F and H, we must also focus on getting compulsory licenses, either on discount prices or waived prices. And not only that, but we have to increase the efficiency of delivery in all these nations, especially the third world nations. Because whether the vaccine gives total protection from the virus or not, one thing is for certain: it does soften the blow. As new variants continually rise, such as a recent Lambda variant confirmed in Peru that has already spread to 29 nations, although not so recent, it has been several months, but it has spread to 29 nations, while other countries continue to deal with the cynical and overwhelming impact of Delta and Alpha variants. One thing that is clear is that the virus is leading in the race against vaccines by a long shot, thanks to the European Union, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and of course the vaccine-making big pharmaceutical companies, who allow the vaccination rates to be low, to be insufficient in a majority of the world, in exchange for a few happy, rich pharmaceutical companies with incredible profit and stingy maintenance of their narcissistic ego and believing that the third world nations could not possibly regulate and maintain safety of their vaccines if given a license to do so. Now, this pandemic has exposed the health equity problem within our world, and it has also exposed the digital divide that comes into play into slow registration, which comes into play in the low vaccination rates in many of the third world countries. That being said, for many third world countries, this is a chance, an opportunity for medical infrastructure, research and facilities to improve. Because otherwise, as this pandemic has exposed, the third world countries will be an afterthought. It is absolutely fundamental to realize that as macroorganisms increasingly go extinct or near extinct / endangered with the climate changing, the keystone species and important predators such as grizzly bears, various sharks, elephants, gorillas, among many others, It is only in accordance with core ecological principles that the microorganisms should increase in species abundance and possibly species diversity. Therefore, in the years ahead, because of the sheer interconnectivity of the highly globalized and continually globalizing world we live in, it is not improbable to expect other pandemics, not long after this one. But either way, this pandemic has exposed world medical inequalities and the seeming insinuation that the rich countries' lives come first. So essentially, private investors and rich companies in countries with the money in low to middle income countries, as well as countries of higher middle income countries, especially where they can manufacture mass vaccines, private companies should seriously consider helping their national government at this time to make world-class or near world-class medical facilities, equipment, and research infrastructure, better connectivity of delivery systems of medications and vaccines, as well as better registration efficiency to be able to meet vaccination supplies, administration rates, and drive further innovation, to be able to be competitive against pathogenic mutations, and to be more self-sufficient and dependable, and therefore more efficient in tackling medical emergencies like this one. After what I have explained, you have the full reason to pressure all the parties that are involved in the decision-making process in the pandemic decision. And so, therefore, every one of us has a reason to pressure them into making the right decision. One that would not only develop underdeveloped facilities and increase rates in supply, but one that would save years and years full of high global expenditure that can be used on far more pressing matters that already exist, such as improving pandemic preparedness for future pandemics, and mitigation and preparedness for future natural disasters, and meeting those very important climate expectations that are required for a better quality of life for the future of humanity. Now, in the end, no matter what kind of people you are, whether you are anti-vaccinators or you are the direct parties that are linked to the decision that has to be made regarding the pandemic currently, one thing is clear, that there is only one question. What do you value more? The illusion of exponential social and economic freedom, or your children's future quality of life? The choice is yours.